Good evening, and welcome to Roosevelt House. I'm Andrew Polsky, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Hunter College and Professor of Political Science. I'd like to remind you before we begin to please turn off or silence your cell phone so it doesn't interrupt us during tonight's event. Thank you. I'd welcome you tonight on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the President of Hunter College, and Harold Holzer, the Jonathan F. Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, who could not be with us this evening. Their absence gives me the opportunity to welcome David Garrow to talk about his important new book, Rising Star: The Making of Barack Obama. Professor Garrow spent approximately as much time researching and writing this landmark biography as Barack Obama spent as President of the United States. The book takes as its focus the formative years of Obama's childhood, his youth, his education, and his community activism, and his political apprenticeship. In sum, all the things that shaped him before he entered the White House. It's an epic study. But the good news is you will improve your upper body strength as you read this. So it's a twofer. In contrast to most presidential biographies, Barack Obama's years in the White House are covered here in only an extended epilogue to the book. Of note in particular is the fact that the president, Barack Obama, gave Professor Garrow 8 hours of off-the-record interviews in preparation for this book, and he also read the manuscript. And as Professor Garrow notes dryly in the acknowledgments, the president had some, quote, understandable remaining disagreements, some strong indeed, with multiple characterizations and interpretations in the book. I suspect we'll hear more about those this evening, either in his talk or in the questions that follow. Rising Star has received strong praise. David Greenberg, professor of history at Rutgers University, wrote in Politico, Rising Star is, quote, one of the most impressive and important books of the year, unquote. He called it, again, quote, a masterwork of historical and journalistic research, Robert Caro-like in its exhaustiveness, easily the most authoritative account of Obama's pre-presidential life that we've seen or are likely ever to see. He added, it's also a terrific read. And that's no surprise. Professor Garrow's Bearing the Cross, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference won a Pulitzer Prize 2 decades ago, and it remains as essential and eye-opening as it was then. His next book, Liberty and Sexuality, The Right to Privacy and the Making of Roe versus Wade, which was published in 1994, remains so relevant today that it has been optioned for the movies. Don't quote me, but I hear that the author met this week with one of the potential producers of that film. Now, let me add a personal note that you won't find in your program. Dave Garrow and I were colleagues at CUNY for a time when he taught at City College, and I was on the faculty here at Hunter. We were both members of the political science doctoral faculty. And I recall the shock that we as faculty members felt when Dave decided to give up his tenured position to pursue his writing. To us in academia, it doesn't get much riskier and bolder than that. But I suppose the academic life still held its attractions. He's had university positions. Since 2011, for example, he has served as professor of law and history and the John E. Murray Faculty Scholar at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. This evening, after Professor Garrow speaks, we'll have time for your questions, not speeches, please. And then we will invite you to join him for a book signing and a reception upstairs in the Four Freedoms room, where copies of Rising Star will be available for sale and exercise. Now, please join me in welcoming Dave Garrow.
Hey, thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you very much to Andrew. I lived here in Manhattan, in West Harlem, and up in Washington Heights for most of the 1980s and 1990s. And so it's always nice to be back in the city, even though Manhattan seems dramatically transformed from what it was in 1984. I really stumbled into doing this book. When Barack, and I always refer to him as Barack because that's what everyone who knew him as a young man and knew him as a politician in Illinois up through 2004, 2005 always has referred to him as. When Barack won the Iowa presidential caucuses in early January of 2008, right at the beginning of that presidential campaign, I was embarrassed that I knew virtually nothing about him, even though he was African American. Given how much of my professional career I've spent writing about not just Dr. King, but issues of race. And so I bought a super cheapy paperback copy of Dreams from My Father, Barack's memoir, and read it when we were on vacation in Madeira. We were living in Cambridge, England, back at that time. And I was both intrigued enough with Dreams and also struck by how obviously incomplete it was that I started reading all of the campaign year biographical journalism about Barack, which quite frankly, again and again disappointed me as being insubstantial and not very curious. I was particularly intrigued with the 3 years that Barack spent as a community organizer on the far south side of Chicago, 1985 to 1988. Clearly a defining period of time for him, but one that the campaign journalism didn't really delve into with any thoroughness at all. So I spent pretty much all of calendar 2008 and early 2009 just reading everything there was, working my way through all the Chicago and Illinois newspapers across all the 1980s up through 2004. And then only in late March of 2009, 2 months or so after Barack was inaugurated, did I go to Chicago for the first time to meet all of the community organizing mentors, Greg Galuzzo, Mike Kruglich, Jerry Kelman, John McKnight, Ken Rowling. And literally my first day there in Chicago, Greg said to me, "Oh, you should go see Marianne Wilson, who was the lawyer who had done the pro bono 501c3 incorporations of all their community groups. And tax lawyers, as I'm certain some people here full well appreciate, save all their files. And so the next morning or the morning thereafter, I go see Ms. Wilson, and she pulls out this old manila file folder of all these documents that Barack himself had typed back in 1986, 1987, including a 3 or 4 page list of every person who had been involved in Barack's community group down in Roseland in those years. And of the 45 or 50 people on that list, only, perhaps 3 of them had ever been tracked down by anyone in the journalism business. And so all of a sudden, I had this, literally list in my hand of all of these people who had known Barack well back in that period in the late 1980s to look for and try to find. All the years that I spent doing my books on Dr. King and the Southern Black freedom struggle taught me very powerfully that the difference between being a scholar and what most journalists do is that you don't just see a sort of sampling of people who were around or involved, but you make the effort to find everyone who was there. This book, all told, is based on literally more than 1,000 interviews And the number is that large in part because in Springfield, the state capital of Illinois, Springfield is a one industry town, politics, and everyone in the Illinois State Capitol building, where Barack spent 8 years in the state Senate, 1997 to 2005, everyone in Springfield throughout those years knew Barack, knew him fairly well in many instances. So that a lot of that 1,000+ interviews are people from Illinois politics, probably a good 200+. But this book really started with all of these community folks and pastors down on the far south side of Chicago, way south. I would bet we've got some people here who've been to Hyde Park, been to the University of Chicago, but Roseland is another 45, 50 blocks south of Hyde Park. When I was spending a lot of time there, 2009, 2010, 2011, there were virtually no other white folks in those neighborhoods other than Chicago cops. But it was a really deeply enjoyable and revelatory experience to find all of those people. The other piece of this, and I should say two things here, the Barack who arrived in Chicago in the late summer of 1985 to begin working with these community groups was someone who was just about to turn 24 years old. And he had driven to Chicago, really knowing no one there other than the one fellow who'd hired him, Jerry Kelman. Barack, in the 3 or 4 months before he went to Chicago, was almost homeless here in New York. He'd broken up in part with his regular girlfriend, Genevieve, who was living over in Carroll Gardens. And Barack was sort of camping out in an empty room of a somewhat legally dicey sublet over in Hell's Kitchen, not the city's best hood in summer, in the spring of 1985. Everyone who had known Barack, whether in high school, at Occidental College, then when he transfers here to Columbia, when he worked for a year at what's now part of The Economist journalistic group, a thing called Business International Corp, over at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza. Everyone who had known Barack through that set of years thought he was a perfectly nice person, but in no way particularly remarkable or memorable. And I realized pretty quickly on in meeting the people in Chicago that it was indeed those 3 years in the community organizing world that really molded and shaped him. When I then got to the stage of beginning to see all the people who had been his fellow classmates and law teachers at Harvard, because he goes to Harvard Law School right from those 3 years on the far south side. In very striking contrast, everyone who met Barack at Harvard Law School, really from day one in the fall of 1988, without exception, thought essentially, voila, this is a remarkable, impressive, unforgettable person whom we'll all be reading about in some context years later. So the dramatic contrast between this sort of unremarkable, forgettable 24-year-old in 1985 and this super impressive 27-year-old in 1988, that's really the centerpiece of this book. And the chapter that means the most to me, chapter 4, is the story of those 3 years on the far south side. Now, Barack begins that work of community group building, very much in the Saul Alinsky tradition that those organizers, the adult organizers who mentored him, had come out of. And the Alinsky tradition was a combative, conflictual, find an enemy and make it into a battle mentality. And Barack pretty quickly realized that he did not have a natural appetite for that approach to local politics and community conflict. And so throughout those 3 years in Chicago, he's in pretty significant tension with the older professional organizers who are trying to teach him. The one exception, and it's a name that very few people, even of my generation, know, John McKnight, still alive, someone who's a character in my King book, because John, back at the time of the Chicago Freedom Movement in 65, 66, was the Midwestern director of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. Was very involved with Dr. King in the Chicago negotiations in 1966 with Mayor Daley. But by 1985, 1987, John was sort of the movement intellectual within the Chicago organizing community, but someone who really was an independent thinker who stood in great contrast to the conflictual Alinsky mindset. And so John is someone who has a very deep but subtle impact on Barack, because John's attitude was that you look for people's strengths and people's resources, and you seek to build community in that way rather than just stoking conflict. Now, when Barack leaves the community organizing world behind to go to law school, he does so with a very conscious intent that he's going to law school in order to be a politician. And in part, that decision to pursue a political career is a reaction of disappointment out of how unfulfilling and underwhelming the community organizing experience had been. And it was in part, too, a response to what a larger-than-life, inspirational public figure Harold Washington had been as Chicago's first African-American mayor during those years. Mayor Washington had taken office in 1983 before Barack gets there. And then Mayor Washington died very suddenly of a massive heart attack in November of 1987, just when Barack is submitting his law school applications. And Washington for Barack was something of an inspirational template. Someone who'd gotten a law degree, someone who'd gone into the state legislature, had moved to a seat in Congress, and then had become mayor. And so with most of his male friends in 1987, 1988, Barack, after he's had a beer or two, is talking about, down the road, maybe he could be mayor of Chicago. Only with the two women to whom he's closest in that 87, 88 period, does he talk about something more than Chicago or more than Illinois? Two women who did not ever know each other, meet each other, but whose memories of Barack, even in 87, 88, talking about how he imagined pursuing the presidency. Two women who have, completely independent but parallel recollections of what Barack is dreaming about when he leaves for Harvard was a very powerful experience for me as a scholar. When Barack gets to Harvard, It's a whole lot easier to track down Harvard Law School graduates to interview than it is, folks who were living in public housing in Chicago in 1986. Because virtually everyone who's graduated from Harvard Law School you can find with about 30 seconds on the web. Finding the community folks was a considerably more challenging enterprise. But it was really striking to me, especially doing this in the context of 2009, 2010, how everyone who knew Barack during those 3 years of law school, without exception, thought of him as the most impressive person at Harvard Law School during that time. And in Dreams from My Father, in 1995, in part, very purposely written as a campaign book, Barack had dramatically exaggerated what a ne'er-do-well student and young man he had been in high school and in college. But the truth of the story was that Barack, when he blossoms during those 3 years at Harvard, is very much taking advantage of what a remarkable education he'd had as a young man in Hawaii at an elite prep school, and what a really first-rate education he'd also had at Occidental and over in Morningside Heights at Columbia. But the Barack Obama whom we can see in Harvard footage and Harvard photos from 88 to 91 is without question the exact same person whom we got to know once he publicly emerged in that 2004 Democratic National Convention, red states, blue states speech that I bet virtually everyone in this room can remember. Barack, during those years at Harvard, was again very consciously preparing himself to go back to Illinois to be a politician. And when he happens to have the good fortune of being elected president of the Harvard Law Review, his first appearance in the New York Times, February 1990, that really, within the world of legal academia, puts an almost literal gold star on his forehead. But he very much does not want to pursue the elite legal world of a Supreme Court clerkship in a big firm. Instead, when he goes directly back to Chicago, he quite purposely joins a small civil rights-oriented firm with a very explicit mentality of wanting to be able to market himself as a civil rights lawyer in a few years' time when he indeed first runs for office. When Barack in 1995, 1996 then first steps forward, he's 34 years old by that point, as a beginning politician, it is extremely striking, and I think this is in this book in a very nice, rich way, how incredibly naive and optimistic Barack was about the promise of politics and the policy impact that he imagined he could have as a state legislator. You look at everything that Barack is saying up through his first 4 or 5 months in the Illinois State Senate, and this is someone who really believes that he's entering some sort of Roman debating society type of institution. I've had more occasion than usual this last week to think back about this because as we've all read for several weeks now, Springfield is one of many examples in the United States of an institution, of a climate where sexual harassment was legion. And so Illinois politics the last week or 10 days has been sort of convulsed by an organized protest of scores of women rising up to speak out against the nature of Illinois politics. And I gather this is happening in a number of state capitals. But when Barack first gets to Springfield, this somewhat parochial, distant political town, Barack is both shocked and depressed at how incredibly disappointing, underwhelming, depressing Illinois state politics turns out to be. He's in the minority party in a Republican-dominated chamber, and the Republicans who control the Illinois State Senate during those years of the late 1990s are dramatically more reactionary than what we have in Washington, D.C. Even today. But Barack makes a very disciplined, very sustained, and relatively successful effort across his first 3 or 4 years in Springfield to really burrow in and make friends and find bipartisan ways to get policy enactments through. Now, most of the actual substance of what Barack is tackling during those years, campaign finance disclosure requirements, earned income tax credits, it's not particularly scintillating or memorable material, but the actual session by session, month by month work that Barack was doing is very striking in showing how much of an effort he put together to actually have an impact in a situation where he had to win active allies from amongst a batch of white downstate, as they use the word in Illinois, Republican conservatives. Emil Jones Jr., who eventually becomes Barack's African-American mentor in Illinois state politics, Emil once very memorably said that outside Chicago, there's this place called Illinois. And that is the world that Barack had to live in. Even though he represented Hyde Park, this little biracial integrated island in Chicago, the world that he really operated in was not so much a Chicago world as this Illinois statewide world. Barack's chief political aide, a man who made incredible contributions to Barack's life, Dan Showman, still a lobbyist in Illinois. Dan starts taking Barack around Illinois, drives him all the way south as far as Cairo, down on the Kentucky border, takes him to Metro East, the Illinois suburbs of St. Louis. And so the whole Illinois political story of Barack's emergence as an eventual statewide candidate there in 2003, 2004 is really the story of this biracial African-American young politician teaching himself this world of white Illinois way outside of Chicago. Now, as I think many of you know, the big misstep that Barack made was when he again tried to follow the Harold Washington template and decided to challenge incumbent African-American Congressman Bobby Rush in 1999-2000. Barack ends up losing that race very badly, gets about 31% of the vote. And in the wake of that defeat, Barack, to a significant degree, starts to transform himself from someone who is less of a policy idealist and someone who's more committed to figuring out how to win and deciding exactly what winning statewide in Illinois is going to take. When Barack had first gotten into politics in the mid-90s, for example, he very quickly endorsed gay marriage. And by the early 2001, he's backed away from that position quite dramatically. And that's something of an indicator of how, once he's positioning himself for something after this congressional defeat, he is much more calculating, much more careful, and much less spontaneous, less revealing about his own initial policy preferences. He also, in significant tension with what he'd first emphasized back in 97, 98 down in Springfield, realizes that in order to be successful statewide, he really does have to insinuate himself with big money donors. And a lot of Barack's ability to be a serious statewide candidate in Illinois come 2003, 2004, is because of the extent of $10,000, $12,000 contributors he recruits, both from the elite Black financial community in Chicago, and also very much in the Jewish world of Chicago. The Pritzkers, the Crowns first and foremost. That's the financial base that really vaults Barack into the U.S. Senate in 2004. Barack emerges as a U.S. Senator through a combination of at least 3 or 4 sort of remarkable political happenstances. Number one, Carol Moseley Braun, who had that U.S. Senate seat before losing it, decides that she's not going to run. Instead, she's going to run for president, some of you might vaguely recall. Had Carol Moseley Braun gotten into that Senate race, you would have had 2 African-American candidates competing against and sort of mutually defeating each other. Then the mega billionaire in the race sort of self-destructs, a very interesting man named Blair Hull. And then the Republican nominee, Jack Ryan, similarly sort of self-destructs. So Barack, by the time he's giving that 2004 Democratic Convention keynote speech, really has a complete free ride on the way to the U.S. Senate. In the 8 years that I spent doing all of this, I was again and again very struck by what a hugely different person Barack Obama was before he got to Washington, D.C. in 2005, in contrast to what we saw as a presidential candidate and then as president. And I was again and again puzzled by why someone who had been so successful at dealing with conservative Republicans back in Illinois wasn't making as disciplined, as consistent an effort in Washington as he had in what I would argue was a more difficult, more challenging context back in Illinois. I think there's a cautionary tale in this of how even someone as brilliant and talented as Barack Obama can unintentionally transform themselves from who they originally were as they become more and more and more of a politician. Andrew alluded to the fact that I had 3 long meetings, 2 of them the better part of the day, at 1600 during calendar 2016 with Barack Obama. Those were in the way of Washington off the record, so I'm not supposed to quote anything he said to me during that whole 8 hours. But I certainly can say that it really brought home to me what a deeply calculating politician Barack had become. And in particular, the extent to which politicians believe in an absolute compartmentalization, separation between the story that they want out there for the public, the story that they want in a book, in a newspaper, in a magazine, and what is the actual reality of their lived lives, especially in the past. And this, to me, is a quite fundamental tension. And tension is really not a strong enough word. This is something I think about every week in reading the journalism of the last, say, 7 or 8 months, is the extent to which political figures try to craft a self-presentation, a self-image that is consciously different from who they actually are. And so that is not just with a Barack Obama, but I think that is a fundamental, enduring problem that someone like myself as a historian has in dealing with an Obama-like figure as distinct from a Martin Luther King. You know, all of my formative experience, as Andrew mentioned, was living in the world of all the people who had worked with Dr. King in the 60s. And very few of those people thought of themselves as, politicians or political figures. And it's a whole lot easier to understand that set of people and that sort of a life than it is to deal with someone who is so consciously self-created as a political figure, political actor. So, looking at the clock, let me stop there, and I'll happily go in whatever directions people might like to go. I believe that the young lady there has a microphone which you should use. Oh, that's the photographer. Why don't you come forward here, the gentleman who's got his hand up right here. Yeah, just wait for here's the young lady, yeah. Go ahead.
In this transformation, how much of it was caused by Axelrod and the advice he was giving him?
Very good question. The transformation begins before Axelrod comes into the picture. Axelrod very much keeps his distance from Barack until really the end of 2002. Axelrod was going to work for Barack in that congressional race back in 99, 2000, and is basically threatened by various voices in Washington, D.C. to not do that. But the more important figure than Axelrod in the U.S. Senate, constructing the U.S. Senate candidacy, was Axelrod's then partner, John Cooper, K-U-P-P-E-R. I'll try to do this very succinctly. Chapter 9, the story of the U.S. Senate race, is, I think, a wonderfully rich chapter because I have all the email from the Senate campaign, all the documents, all the email traffic, Obama for Illinois. And you can see John Cooper coaching Barack on how to answer interview questions. It's a real sculpting of a political presentation. Now, in the public story, all the credit for that has been claimed by David Axelrod, especially in Axelrod's own memoir. And in contrast, John Cooper is a completely self-effacing figure. But the people, Dan Schoeman, whom I mentioned earlier, who literally held Barack's hand for six years, Schoeman and Cooper deserve more credit than Axelrod for making Barack a successful politician. The young lady in the back row there? Yeah, right, yeah, she's right beside, yeah.
Young lady, thank you so much.
Oh, well.
I'm a senior citizen. How did he get picked to be the speaker at the 2004 convention? I happened to be there that night,
Sure.
and it was really riveting. But how did that come about?
It's a combination of several influences. Jimmy Cawley, who was the campaign manager of the Senate race, Jimmy Cawley and Pete Giangreco, another consultant who was working on that race, Cawley and Giangreco started lobbying the people around John Kerry. And again, I mean, as this first questioner very nicely put his finger on, you get an awful lot of Axelrod. Well, wrong. That's the documentary history is there. And then, in addition, the convention manager for the Kerry campaign, a guy named Jack Corrigan, happened to have as a very good friend a woman with whom he'd worked on the Dukakis campaign back in '88, Lisa Hay, who's now a federal public defender in Oregon. And Lisa, perchance, had been Barack's number 2 on the Harvard Law Review. And both Lisa and her husband, Scott Smith, have always told this story about how Barack, at a banquet during the Harvard Law Review period, had been such an impressive speaker that even the African-American wait staff at the Harvard Club of Boston had stopped clearing dishes in order to listen to Barack. So Lisa Hay tells her friend Corrigan this story of how what a remarkably transformative speaker Barack Obama had been in 1988. So it's a combination. This gentleman right here in she's on she's on this side.
Can you elaborate on the differences between the public image that Obama wanted to project and and what you feel is the actual Obama, and what differences did he express
Right.
Unreconciled with what
Right.
you've said in your book?
Yes. Let me sort of take that in two parts. The easy part of that is all of the policy positions in which Barack, as president, was so different from whom he'd been in Illinois. Campaign finance reform, number 1. That was his signature issue when he first emerges in Illinois as a protege of Paul Simon, the former U.S. Senator who always wore bow ties, if that helps people remember the right Paul Simon. Come 2004, Barack rejects, public campaign financing. And this gets into a whole nother issue that we see in this last 8 months. The Barack and Michelle Obama of 2003, 2004 were not hobnobbing with celebrities and billionaires and staying on Richard Branson's island. So the whole sort of money world, both with campaign finance, but also in terms of the way they approach the world, that's the most dramatic transformation of the Obamas. The gay marriage alteration I mentioned earlier. Barack, back in Illinois, had been a really outspoken critic of the intelligence community and the Patriot Act, Guantanamo. But then the harder part of this is, and again, since we're recording, and I've got to think about how to say this appropriately. It's surprising that someone could spend 8 years as president of the United States and still want their history of girlfriends from before when they were married to be omitted from the public record. I found that very puzzling because there's nothing in any way remarkably unusual in the history of Barack Obama's private life. People have girlfriends before they get married. But you'd think that after someone had been a public figure for 8 to 10 years, they would not be hypersensitive to such an aspect of their life story. And it's worth my really emphasizing here to try to make this clear. For those of you who in the past have read Dreams from My Father, there are no women in Dreams. There is about a 2-sentence description of a composite fictional girlfriend who is about 25% Alex, 25% Genevieve, and 50% Sheila, the 3 significant girlfriends. The fact that a book that purports to be a sort of autobiographical memoir says absolutely nothing about interpersonal relationships is a sort of precursor window into the person whom I then met. Let's go to the gentleman, yes.
I think I can project.
Okay.
Regarding that last point, was that a racial transformation, a political racial transformation?
Sheila Yeager was a wonderful person, one of the top U.S. experts on Korea. Sheila's the woman Barack lived with in Hyde Park from 1986 to 1988. That is certainly Sheila's understanding of the life they lived together. It's worth my mentioning Sheila's half Japanese, half Dutch. Her paternal grandparents are Holocaust heroes who are in Yad Vashem because they sheltered Jewish people, particularly Jewish children, in the Netherlands during the Holocaust. It's during those years in Chicago, 85 to 88, that Barack really becomes black. In Hawaii, in Jakarta, at Oxy, at Columbia, when he's kicking around Brooklyn and Manhattan here, 83 to 85, Barack's entire friendship network throughout those years is primarily international students. The first really close African-American friend Barack develops, Johnny Owens, is a Chicago native whom he hires as his deputy in 1986. And so it's only as part of the Far South Side learning experience that Barack learns to become African American rather than a biracial young man who was fundamentally Hawaiian, and whose whole friendship network was mainly Pakistani, Indian, South Asian young men who'd grown up in London, grown up in the Gulf states, were very much children of international privilege. Punahou in Honolulu, where Barack went, is an elite, even by, Upper East Side standards, a really elite prep school. I alluded to this very indirectly. The quality of the classes that Barack had as a high school student at Punahou, which is in here in quite some detail, they're like college sophomore level classes. I mean, he, again, likes to say he spent all his time at the beach and, body surfing and drinking this and smoking that. I mean, that's he's engaging in a self-parody there. The lady right here with the blonde, I'm trying to do both sides of the room here. Okay, sure, go ahead, Sure, go ahead.
My question to you is Barack Obama as an enigma. I'm Michael Myers, by the way, the president. As an enigma.
Oh, sure.
I'm
Michael,
Myers,
yes.
New York Civil Rights Coalition. Law school editorial law review. Where are the publications? Why the reticence to produce one's birth certificate? If he's an international student in terms of his own image, did he present himself as an international student in terms of getting into graduate school, et cetera? So my question to you is really, what about the history of him as a black nationalist? You didn't mention Reverend Jeremiah Wright. I don't get it.
Right.
He considered himself the mentor of Barack Obama. So my question is to you, Barack Obama enigma, what is he hiding?
Let me take two things out of that. Barack gets to know Jeremiah for the first time in 1987, and he's very close to Jeremiah. This is not going to make people happy. I am very pro Jeremiah Wright. No one should go down in history based on the three stupidest things they've ever said in their lives. And that's where Jeremiah has ended up. Jeremiah's not in good health, since we're recording. People who really know Black Chicago think of Jeremiah as a sort of substitute father figure for Barack. And I'm very sympathetic to that judgment. But once Barack and Michelle joined Trinity in 1992 in order to get married there, Barack is no longer as close to Jeremiah in the 1990s and the early 2000s as he was in the earlier years. And so I would not, Emil Jones, whom I referred to earlier, old line, Chicago Machine Paul, Emil is a much more important African-American mentor to Barack, I would say Michael, than Jeremiah, even though Jeremiah got so much attention back in 2008, 2009. You mentioned in terms of the law school law review publications, I'll just say one quick thing because I omitted it earlier. Barack's closest friend in law school, Rob Fisher, white guy, economist, had taught college economics for 6 years. Rob and Barack, during law school, wrote a book manuscript together that they intended to get published. Rob still today thinks about could they get this published as a historical artifact. It's about 150 pages. And you can tell what parts are written by Rob and what parts are written by Barack, I think. I present a lot of this in there. Barack didn't publish anything major in the Law Review when he was president. That wasn't particularly remarkable or unusual. But this thing that he and Rob spent a lot of time writing together is a real piece of scholarship, which Rob and Rob's mother, found in, different family homes 5 or 6 years ago. Okay. Oh, and we've got to come back to this lady over here, too. She was very nice. No, the lady back there, yeah.
I don't know if you looked at this, but if you did, in this transformation you've talked about, what role did Michelle play?
Less than we might think, or less than people might like to hear. And the crux of that is that Michelle, from time one, was incredibly dubious about his whole idea of being a politician. From when they first get involved in the summer of 1989 through when they get engaged in the summer of 1991 and then get married in the fall of 1992, she's willing to sort of tolerate his idea that he'll be an electoral politician. But she and everyone who knows them during those years, without exception, describes this similarly. She's just waiting for him to get this out of his system. She, apropos of some of what I said 25 or 30 minutes ago, she does not like the idea of him spending time in Springfield, Illinois. Though Barack's behavior in Springfield was pristine. In fact, people in Springfield thought he was really unusual because his behavior was pristine. But especially after the congressional loss in 2000, Michelle really wants him to give this up, and she had not participated at all in that campaign. And she was very reluctant, very hesitant to sign on for the Senate race in 2002, 2003. So when all of a sudden, he emerges as a successful politician, it's a amazing astonishment to her. Let's come back. And the very polite lady over here.
I was going to ask that question. I'm going to ask it a different way now. Michelle's history, personal history, is so very different.
Yes.
And you talk about sort of the Black ethnicity of her. How did that ended up meshing together? So in that sense, how did she have an influence on him?
It's not a political influence. I think, right. The great, and I'm not, I'm someone who shies away from any very expressly psychological, psychoanalytic type stuff. I think Michelle, as most people here know, and her brother Craig came out of a very tight, close, loving, warm, successful family story. And Barack, as I think you all know, was not only abandoned quite expressly by his father, he was in large part also abandoned by his mother. Barack is raised by his maternal grandparents. And so I think a great deal of the attraction with regard to Michelle was a desire to become a part of a family life that had been completely lacking in his own earlier experience and upbringing. And I think that very directly informs why for 19, 20 years now he has been such an exceptionally devoted father because the number one lesson he took away from the first 18 years of his life is that he did not have a father. Right down here.
I wanted you to comment on Maya Sotoro Ding, who I recently spent a whole day with. She came to New York City, and she is his half-sister.
Right.
If there are some people who don't know, and she loves the mother. So she speaks and she doesn't really speak about her brother that much, but I wondered what kind of influence she'd had on his life.
Maya, Barack's younger sister, Ann Dunham, Barack's mother, Ann really did raise Maya in a way that she did not raise Barack. And Maya really lived with Ann all throughout, the first 18 years of Maya's life, to when she comes here to start college at Barnard. Barack's childhood was radically different than Maya's on that. And one last one, I think I know way back in the corner up there, right around the corner. Whoops, yeah, there we go, great.
Thanks. One of the things that you mentioned was about sort of the power of Chicago's Black political community. And reading your book, thinking about sort of his race against Alice Palmer, his first state Senate
Yes.
race, and his transgressions against Alice Palmer, I'm wondering how he was able to sort of get back into the good graces of that political community. Does it speak to his own craftiness as a politician, or did folks just kind of see his potential and say, we're going to let it go?
Sure. For folks that don't know the detail of the story, let me say Alice Palmer was an African-American state senator who'd had the state Senate seat that Barack took and who was tossed off the ballot by Barack's folks because her ballot petition signatures had been ineptly, corruptly produced. Alice Palmer was a great state legislator, but the Chicago Black nationalist community around Alice Palmer never forgave Barack, not only during the U.S. Senate race, right up, and I can certainly say Alice Palmer never forgave Barack. Barack himself, in 1995, when that's happening, that young, early, naive Barack of 1995, he doesn't want his folks to do to Palmer what they did. And Barack felt guilty about it. And that, perchance, is another example of how dramatically different the Barack Obama of, say, 2007 is than the Barack Obama of 1995. Do we have time for one more? Or, okay, David. Oh, where's the young lady with the mic? Whoops. David, go ahead then.
Yeah, okay. I want you to focus a little bit on the journalism that you referred to before. You obviously started this book before the various other people who wrote about Obama came along, including several book authors.
Right.
So you seem that you watched them come and go. They came out with their books. They came in after you did. They came out with their books before you did. What did you learn about how selectively other people reported this story, and what were their respective agendas?
Right. The David Remnick book on Barack that came out in spring of 2010 was a perfectly solid book, especially for someone who had a day job. There's also, though it got very little attention, there's a very credible book by a Chicago journalist, Ed McClelland, called Young Mr. Obama. Ed had written a profile of Barack during that 2000 congressional race for the Chicago Reader. And so Ed really sort of knew Chicago politics. As a white guy, he didn't know the black piece of it that much. But I mean, with all due respect to somebody like David Remnick or Ed McClelland, they're doing a few dozen interviews. I mean, maybe all told in the Remnick book, you might have 70. I'm guessing to throw that number out there. I'd have to go back and count. So the difference with me is not that I'm any smarter or more perceptive. It's just that I am agonizingly thorough about tracking people down. And I learned this during the King, and this is what I learned from King World, that you don't, and this is worth saying, that you don't just interview Andy Young, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy. You interview the church secretary, the church janitor. And that was the great, Michael asked about Jeremiah Wright. You don't just talk to Reverend Wright, you interview Reverend Wright's secretary, and you interview folks in the congregation. And, everybody in the congregation says, nope, he was never around. They never showed up. They weren't there. So the one advantage I have is just this sort of, thoroughness of time investment. But I mean, that's my basic attitude towards this, is that it's a professional obligation to invest the time. We don't, I say this to you, we don't make much money off of this stuff. It's you got to do it because you believe that there's an obligation. And that's what I learned from all the folks around Dr. King. So that's the meaning of it to me. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
So let me just remind you that David will be upstairs signing copies of the book, and I just have one favor to ask, is if there's somebody who will help me carry this copy upstairs,